The steel gave way with a sound like a rifle shot across frozen pasture, and by the time the insurance company finished with her, they'd call her a fraud for fixing it herself. What happened between that crack in January and the vindication that followed would become the kind of story ranchers tell at the co-op counter for years, but not before they mocked her for it first. She was 39 years old, 17 years into running the 640 acres her father had built into a cattle operation before arthritis took his hands and handed her the deed instead. Roughly 140 head grazed that land in a normal year, red-brown bodies scattered across brown winter grass, and every one of them mattered to a banknote that never seemed to shrink. $11,400 was due in 6 weeks. She had known that number the way she knew her own pulse. The Massey Ferguson 3660 had been hers since 2011, bought used with 6,240 hours already worked into its bones by the time she signed the papers, and thousands more logged since under her own hands. It was not a glamorous machine. It was a working one, diesel-streaked, mud-caked, dependable in the way old iron is dependable when a person maintains it, with the discipline of someone who cannot afford not to. She kept a binder for it, oil changes and filter swaps, and hour readings recorded in her own handwriting, the kind of paperwork nobody asks to see until they desperately need it. The break happened on an ordinary January morning during a calving check, the ground frozen hard enough to ring under boot heels, mud gripping the tires in the low spots where the frost hadn't quite won yet. She was lifting a round bale to spread for a cluster of heifers close to their time when she heard it, a crack, sudden and clean, coming from deep in the loader arm near the pivot pin housing. The arm dropped a few inches, hung wrong, canted at an angle that told her everything before she even climbed down to look. A stress fracture, she would learn, right where the metal had been asked to bear weight for 13 years without complaint until it finally couldn't anymore. She stood in the mud a long moment, breath fogging, cattle indifferent around her, and did the arithmetic every rancher does in that kind of silence: what it would cost, what she had, and how far apart those two numbers stood. Calving season had barely started. She had 130 cows carrying calves she could not afford to lose, and a tractor she could not afford to be without. The nearest answer was Panhandle Ag Service, 40 minutes down the highway, where a service counter and a factory parts catalog waited to tell her exactly how much that silence was going to cost. She left the heifers to the cold and drove the 40 minutes with the heater on high and the radio off, going over the sound of that crack in her mind the way another person might replay a car accident. By the time she pulled into the gravel lot at Panhandle Ag Service, she had already priced out 3 scenarios in her head, and none of them ended well. The counter inside smelled like fresh rubber gaskets and burnt coffee, and the man behind it, a service writer she'd dealt with twice before, both times over routine parts, pulled up the Massey Ferguson 3660 specs on a monitor angled just enough that she couldn't read it herself. He didn't waste time. A replacement loader arm, factory spec, would run $4,150, parts and labor included, and that was before he even mentioned the wait. 11 days, he said, maybe longer if the distribution warehouse in Oklahoma City was backed up again, which it usually was this time of year. She asked if there was a used arm anywhere in the region, salvage or otherwise, and he shook his head slowly, the kind of headshake that wasn't really an answer so much as a dismissal. 11 days, $4,150. She had 6 weeks until her note came due at $11,400, and 130 cows who didn't care what a distribution warehouse in Oklahoma City was doing with its inventory. She stood at that counter doing the same arithmetic she'd done in the mud, except now the numbers had names and deadlines attached to them, and neither column moved any closer to the other, no matter how she rearranged them. 11 days without a loader in the middle of calving meant hauling hay by hand across frozen ground for heifers who needed feed twice a day, meant risking a fall on ice with a 100-pound bale in her arms instead of a machine, meant hoping nothing else broke while she waited on a part that might not even arrive on schedule. $4,150 meant either draining the operating account she needed for vet bills and feed through spring, or asking the bank for more credit against a note she was already stretched to make. She thanked the service writer, told him she'd think it over, and walked back out into the cold without committing to anything. Sitting in the truck in that gravel lot, engine idling, she thought about the grain auger rusting behind her equipment shed, retired since her father's last harvest with it, steel tubing thick enough that she'd once joked it was built to outlive them all. She didn't know yet exactly what she was going to do with it. But she knew she wasn't calling Panhandle Ag Service back, and she knew she wasn't waiting 11 days for anybody's warehouse in Oklahoma City. The auger had sat behind the equipment shed for 15 years, tires flat, paint chalked white by sun and hail, but the tubing itself had never once shown rust through in all that time, and she knew why. Her father bought that auger new in 1987, back when a man could still special order heavier gauge steel from a fabricator in Amarillo without paying a premium for it, and he'd told her more than once that he'd rather carry the extra weight across the yard than watch a cheaper unit buckle under a full bin of wheat. She walked out to it that evening with a tape measure, a flashlight, and a caliper she'd bought years ago for sorting bolt sizes, and she started taking numbers the way she'd take numbers on a sick calf, methodically, writing each one down in a spiral notebook she kept in the truck for exactly this kind of work. The factory arm on the Massey Ferguson, according to the parts diagram Panhandle Ag Service had printed for her, ran 0.312 inches of wall thickness through the section that had failed. She measured the auger tubing 3 times, in 3 different places, rotating the caliper each time to make sure she wasn't reading a warped section. Every reading came back the same, 0.365 inches. Nearly 17% thicker steel, sitting unused, already paid for a lifetime ago. She sat on an overturned bucket in the cold with the flashlight propped against her knee and did the math on what that meant, not in tensile strength tables she didn't have, but in the plain language of load and leverage she'd learned watching her father repair everything on this place rather than replace it. Thicker wall meant more material resisting bend at the exact point where the factory arm had given out, the pivot pin housing, where months of frozen ground and heavy bales had worked a stress fracture invisible to the eye until the day it wasn't. If she could cut a clean section of that auger tubing, sleeve it properly over the remaining factory stub, and weld it with full penetration rather than a quick tack job, she wasn't building something weaker than what had broken. She was building something the original engineers might have used themselves if the cost sheet had allowed it. She knew what the coffee counter at the co-op would say if word got out. She could already hear the laughter, the jokes about baling wire and desperation. She knew what a bank loan officer would say about unlicensed fabrication versus a factory part with a warranty behind it. None of that changed the numbers in her notebook. She closed it, clicked off the flashlight, and walked back to the house already running the sequence of cuts in her head, already deciding which grinder wheel she'd need first, and already knowing she'd need better welding rod than what she had left in the shop. The drive to the salvage yard took 22 minutes on ice-slick county road, and she made it in 19, foot heavier than she'd admit to anyone who might ask. The welding rod she had left in the shop was rated for mild steel, thin-gauge stuff meant for fence panels and gate hinges, not for a structural member that would carry 1,800 pounds of frozen hay a dozen times a day. She needed 70-18 rod, low hydrogen, the kind that laid down a bead with real tensile strength behind it, and she needed enough of it to run multiple passes without stopping halfway through a joint. The yard sat behind a row of dead combines and a stack of hog panels rusting into the shape of the ground beneath them. The woman who ran the place had sold farm scrap and salvage steel for going on 15 years, and she came out from behind a shelving unit, wiping grease off her hands with a rag that had long since stopped being useful for that purpose. She listened to the whole plan without interrupting: the pivot pin housing, the sleeve, the wall thickness comparison already written in the notebook riding on the truck seat, and she nodded the way people nod when they're doing arithmetic they don't say out loud. She walked her back to the auger section without being asked, ran a caliper over 3 different lengths of tubing until she found one that measured out clean and consistent, no pitting, no old stress marks from its years spinning grain. .365 inches of wall, same as the notebook already said, but seeing it confirmed on a second instrument mattered. 1 measurement was a claim, 2 measurements from 2 different tools was a fact. She bought 40 feet of rod, more than she needed, because a job like this wasn't the place to run short with a torch already lit and a bead half finished. She bought a new grinding disc, rated for thicker material, since her old ones had gone thin and glassy from years of lighter work, and she asked, before she left, whether the woman would be willing to look over the joint once it was cut and fitted, before any welding started, not because she doubted her own eye, but because a second set of eyes from someone who understood steel, the way this woman did, was worth more than pride. The woman said she would, said it plainly, the way people say things they mean and don't intend to repeat. Driving home with the tubing lashed down in the truck bed, the sky had gone the color of wet concrete, and the wind had that particular bite that meant the ground would freeze harder before it thawed. 4 days. That was what she'd given herself. She intended to use every hour of it. Day 1 began before the sun, the shop lights buzzing on over a concrete floor still cold enough to hold the shape of her boot soles. She laid the auger tubing across 2 sawhorses and marked it with soapstone, measuring from the pivot pin housing outward, then measuring again from the opposite end, because a cut made from only 1 reference point was a cut made on faith, and faith wasn't going to hold 400 pounds of hay in freezing mud. The chop saw threw sparks the color of a struck match, and the smell of hot steel filled the shop the way it had filled her father's shop 30 years before, a smell she associated less with danger than with problems getting solved. She dry-fit the first section against the snapped factory arm, setting the broken halves side by side, like a surgeon laying out an X-ray, comparing wall thickness with her fingers before she ever picked up the calipers again. The auger steel sat heavier in her hand, denser, the kind of material that didn't flex when you leaned on it, and she thought about all the years that tubing had spun grain through a hopper without complaint, never asked to bear a side load, never asked to survive an ice storm. It would be asked now. The sleeve joint took most of the morning, cutting the collar to overlap the break by 4 inches on each side, longer than the shop manual would have called for on a factory piece, because she wasn't trying to match a factory piece, she was trying to beat one. She ground the mating surfaces until they shone bare and silver, wiped them down twice, because rust and mill scale under a bead was how welds failed quietly. Weeks later, in the middle of a lift nobody was watching. By early afternoon, she drove back out to the salvage yard with the tubing cut and fitted. No welding yet, just as she'd promised. The woman walked the joint slow, ran a thumbnail along the ground edge, tilted it under the fluorescent light, and studied it the way another person might study a suspect's signature. She asked about penetration depth, about amperage, about whether the ranch's welder could hold a steady arc on metal this thick without the machine's duty cycle cutting out halfway through a pass. The ranch's welder was old, she admitted, a 225-amp stick machine bought second-hand in 2014, but it had never failed her on anything smaller, and she intended to run test beads on scrap first, more than one, until the machine and her hand agreed on what a proper pass looked like. The woman nodded once, slow, and said the fit was as good as she'd seen out of anybody who hadn't gone to trade school for it. That was not flattery. It was closer to a verdict. Driving home in the last gray light, she began running the weld sequence in her head. Root pass, fill pass, cap, counting the hours she had left before calving forced her hand whether the arm was ready or not. The shop held cold, like a held breath the next morning, the kind of cold that made the concrete floor feel wet even when it was dry, and she worked the space heater until the far corner where the vise sat finally climbed above 40 degrees. She laid 3 scrap coupons of the auger tubing across a steel table and struck her first test bead at 140 amps, watching the puddle wander, listening to the arc's pitch the way her father used to listen to an engine for a miss. Too cold. She bumped it to 155, ran a second bead, and this time the metal flowed clean, the ripple even, no undercut biting into the base metal at the edges. She let it cool, then took a grinder to the cross-section, cutting the bead in half to look at the fusion line the way a surgeon might look at a suture. The penetration ran deep and even, no cold lap, no porosity pockets breathing back at her like small black eyes. She wrote the number down in the composition notebook she'd started keeping the day the arm cracked. 155 amps, 332-inch, 70-18 rod, room temperature 41 degrees Fahrenheit, because if anyone ever asked her to prove what she'd done, she intended to have an answer more solid than memory. She ran 4 more test beads across the afternoon, varying travel speed, watching how the machine's duty cycle handled a full 6-inch pass before the thermal overload light blinked its warning. Twice it cut out on her, and both times she waited the full 90 seconds the manual called for before striking another arc, refusing to rush the machine any more than she would rush a mare in labor. By the 4th bead her hand had settled into rhythm, the hood dropping and rising in a motion she no longer had to think about, muscle memory doing what nerve alone could not. She held the coupon up to the light and saw a bead she would not have been ashamed to show the mechanic who'd sold her the tubing, or the inspector she did not yet know was coming, or her father, if he'd lived to see what his 60-year-old ranch shop had turned into. That evening she cleaned the actual arm sections with a wire wheel until the metal shone bare and gray, beveled the joint edges at the angle she'd practiced, and set up the tack welds that would hold everything true while she ran the real passes. She checked the fit one more time with a square, then with a tape, then by eye, the way she'd been taught to trust her hands only after she'd trusted the instruments first. The cows were bawling somewhere out past the pole barn, restless in the cold, and she knew she had maybe 5 days before one of them dropped a calf in weather that would not forgive a broken loader twice. She switched off the shop light, stood a moment in the dark listening to the wind pick up out of the northwest, and understood the real welding would begin at first light, whether she felt ready or not. First light came the color of dishwater, low and flat over the caprock, and she was in the shop before the sun cleared the windbreak, coffee going cold on the workbench beside her welding log. She had ruled a fresh page the night before, columns for pass number, amperage, rod type, and observation, because a man from Prairie Sentinel Mutual had already used the word fraud in writing, and she intended to leave him nothing to stand on but his own bad judgment. The auger tubing lay across 2 sawhorses, cut to length, beveled, tacked in 4 places exactly as she'd rehearsed, and she circled the joint twice more with a flashlight before she ever dropped her hood. She struck her first real arc at 7:52 by the clock nailed above the drill press, and the bead ran clean and narrow, the puddle wetting out evenly into both the auger steel and the salvaged factory stub she was marrying it to. She logged it. Pass 101611 rod, 110 amps, full penetration by sound and color, no undercut. She let it cool, exactly as long as the chart in her father's old binder said a joint that thickness needed, resisting the urge to rush it the way the shop in town would have, the way anybody billing by the hour would have. By mid-morning she was 3 passes deep, cap layer still ahead of her, and she'd stopped twice to grind out a pass that showed the faintest gray shadow of porosity, because an arm that failed at 40 degrees below wind chill, with a bred heifer stranded beneath it, wasn't going to care that she'd been in a hurry. She thought of the coffee counter at the co-op, the way the men had laughed when she'd said grain auger steel, and she found the laughter useful now, a kind of fuel, though she didn't waste breath on it. She thought instead about wall thickness, .365 against .312, 53 thousandths of margin she intended to prove wasn't guesswork, and about the mechanic at the salvage yard who'd run a caliper over that tubing before she ever paid for it, and told her, flatly, that it would carry more than the factory ever had. By early afternoon, the arm had its final cap pass, still too hot to touch, weld crown ground smooth enough to check with a straight edge. She logged the time, the temperature, the visual grain of the metal as it cooled from orange to gray. Outside, the wind had swung harder out of the north, carrying the particular smell of moisture that meant more than cold was coming, and she stood in the doorway a long moment, studying the sky the way she studied a weld, before she went back in to start the second arm. The second arm was never meant for the loader. It was a control piece, cut from the same length of auger tubing, carrying the same 0.365-inch wall, welded with the same rod and the same heat settings, so that when she finally put a number on strength, she'd have 2 things to compare, not just one thing to trust. She had read enough insurance boilerplate over the years to know that a claim adjuster wanted more than a good story. He wanted evidence that repeated itself, evidence that didn't depend on her word alone, so she built duplication into the work from the start, the way her father had always kept 2 thermometers in the calving barn instead of 1, distrusting any single reading that couldn't be checked against another. By 4 in the afternoon, both arms sat on sawhorses, cooling under shop light, and she moved between them with a tape measure and a notebook, already thick with numbers. She recorded weld bead width at 6 points along each seam, recorded penetration depth where she'd ground a witness cut on a scrap offcut from the same tubing run, recorded ambient shop temperature at 61 degrees so no one could later claim the metal had cured under conditions it wouldn't see in the field. She photographed the pivot pin housing from 4 angles, the bore diameter checked twice with a dial caliper, matching factory spec within 2 thousandths. None of it was required. None of it would be asked for, not yet. But she had learned enough about people who doubted her to know that doubt didn't wait for permission, and that the only defense against being disbelieved was to have already answered the question before anyone thought to ask it. Outside, the wind had gone from steady to insistent, pushing at the shop's tin siding with a low percussive rattle that made the dog lift her head from the corner. The sky over the caprock had taken on the flat gray-white look that old-timers called ice sky, a color that meant something different than snow sky, heavier, wetter, more dangerous to steel and bone alike. She'd heard the radio mention a system moving down from the Panhandle border, and she filed it the way she filed everything now, as a fact to be weighed against the work in front of her rather than a reason to hurry it. She let the first arm cool 2 more hours before she trimmed the excess mounting plate and squared the edges with a grinder, checking flush against a framing square until the light showed no gap. Then she carried it to the hydraulic press in the corner of the shop, rigged a fixture from scrap angle iron, and began the first cycle of what she'd already decided to call, in her notebook, the load test, a term she'd chosen deliberately, plainly, because it was the kind of language that couldn't be dismissed as guesswork, only checked. The press hissed once as she bled the initial pressure down, watching the gauge needle climb in 50-pound increments while the fixture groaned under the new arm's weight. She had rigged the setup so the load bore exactly where the pivot pin housing would sit once mounted, replicating the same angle the factory arm carried when a bale swung out over the loader bucket. 600 pounds, no shift in the weld bead, 900. She crouched, ran her palm along the seam where the sleeve met the auger tubing, feeling for the faint warmth or vibration that would tell her something was working loose beneath the surface. Nothing. 1,200 pounds held for 90 seconds by her count on the kitchen timer she'd clipped to her coverall pocket, and still the bead sat clean, silver gray and unbroken under the shop light. She wrote each number down in the notebook without letting herself feel anything yet, because feeling came after documentation, not before it. And she had learned that lesson at 4 in the morning, over a stillborn heifer calf years back, when she'd trusted her gut over her numbers and lost the argument to both. The wind found a gap in the tin roof and screamed through it, and the dog's ears flattened, and she glanced once toward the window where the ice sky pressed down gray and low over the caprock, like something with weight of its own. 1,500 pounds. The press fixture creaked, but the arm didn't. She backed the pressure off slowly, the way she'd learned to release tension on a come-along, no sudden drops, and then she ran the full cycle again from 0, because a single pass proved nothing except that a weld could hold once, and once was a story, not a fact. By the third cycle, her hands had gone raw from the cold seeping through the shop's concrete floor, and she stopped only long enough to wrap them in a rag and pour coffee that had gone tepid an hour before. The second arm, the spare she'd fabricated in case the first split under testing, sat clamped in the vise nearby, finished but unproven, waiting its turn under the press. She thought, briefly, of the adjuster's letter still folded in the kitchen drawer, the word fraud typed flat and certain across the page, and she let the thought pass through her without settling, because anger, like guesswork, cost more than it returned. Outside, the first pellets of sleet began ticking against the tin roof, faint at first, then steadier, gathering rhythm the way trouble on the panhandle always did, quietly, then all at once, until a rancher either had her numbers ready or she didn't. She logged the third cycle's peak pressure, checked it against the second, and set the notebook down open on the workbench, the page still damp with condensation, the ink already drying into evidence. By midnight, the sleet had thickened into a steady hiss against the roof, and she killed the shop lights to save the generator fuel, working now by a headlamp strapped over a wool cap, her breath fogging in the cone of light. She checked the weld on the pivot pin housing one more time with a flashlight held at a low angle, the way the salvage yard mechanic had taught her, hunting for the faint shadow of a lap fault or a pinhole that daylight would have hidden. There was none. The bead ran clean, consistent, the crown low and even. 3 passes fused into one continuous seam that caught the light without a ripple. She measured wall thickness again at 4 points around the tube, 0.365 inches, unchanged, no thinning from heat, no warp from the grinder, and wrote the numbers down beside the earlier set so the pattern would speak for itself instead of her memory. The cows didn't care about weld penetration. Through the gap in the shop door, she could hear them shifting in the corral, hooves breaking the crust of refreezing mud, a few bawling low and steady the way they did when the barometer dropped, and their bodies knew before the sky told them. She'd moved the closest to calving heifers into the shed 2 days earlier on instinct alone, a decision that now looked less like caution and more like foresight, though she granted herself no credit yet. Instinct wasn't documentation. Documentation was what she had spread across the workbench. Pressure readings, tubing measurements, 4 days of dated entries in a ranch supply notebook with a coffee ring on the cover, the whole record built the way her father used to keep his. Plainly, stubbornly, in numbers nobody could argue with later. She lifted the bale a fourth time, holding it at full extension for a slow count of 30 while the gauge needle sat still, refusing to creep. Then she lowered it, cycled the boom down to rest, and shut off the tractor, letting the diesel knock fade into the sleet's white noise. In the sudden quiet, she became aware of how tired she was. Not the ordinary tiredness of long days, but the deeper kind that came from 4 nights of measuring instead of sleeping, and she allowed herself exactly one long breath before reaching for the notebook again. Outside, the ice kept building on the fence wire and the barn eaves, a fine, glassy coat thickening by the hour, indifferent to insurance letters or coffee counter opinions. She thought of the neighboring rigs parked in open yards a few miles off, arms unguarded, unproven, and wondered, not with satisfaction, only with the flat calculation of a woman counting risk, how long steel could hold weight it was never built to carry before something, somewhere, gave. The answer came 2 days later, though not in the way she expected. The storm had settled into the kind of grinding, low-gray weather that made the whole county feel sealed under glass, and she was out before dawn checking heifers when she heard the first sound of trouble carried thin across the frozen air. A metallic crack, distant, like a rifle shot muffled by distance and ice. She didn't think much of it until the phone started ringing at the house an hour later, one neighbor after another, voices clipped with the particular embarrassment of men reporting bad news about their own machines. A deer arm had gone first, snapped clean at the boss where the cylinder mounted, the operator lucky to jump clear before 1,100 pounds of frozen hay came down where his knees had been. Then another deer, same failure, same age of steel fatigued by a decade of hard use. Then a case IH, its arm folding sideways under an ice-crusted bale like it had been made of tin instead of forged plate. She listened to each account with the same careful attention she gave her own gauges, filing details without comment, hours on the machine, age of the arm, whether it had ever been inspected for stress cracking. None of the men mentioned maintenance logs because none of them kept any. That, she thought, was the difference nobody wanted to name out loud, not brand, not luck, but record-keeping, the kind her father had drummed into her before she was old enough to drive the tractor herself. By mid-morning, the co-op was buzzing with it, and for once, the talk wasn't circling her name in ridicule but in careful, uneasy silence, punctuated by someone finally asking, almost reluctantly, whether her rig was still standing. It was. She'd checked it herself before coming to town. Boom locked down, weld lines clean under a skin of frost, no flex, no give, nothing but the quiet certainty of steel that had been measured twice and trusted once it earned it. She didn't say much when the question came, just nodded once and let the silence answer for her, the same way her stress test log had answered the adjuster's accusations without a single raised voice. But driving home along the frozen section line road, watching power lines sag under their glaze and fence posts wearing collars of ice, she felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph exactly, more like the settling of a scale that had been tilted too long. The storm wasn't finished yet, but for the first time since the fracture in January, she suspected it was about to do more convincing than she ever could. The independent inspector arrived 4 days later, a compact woman in a Prairie Sentinel mutual jacket, carrying a caliper case and a clipboard thick with claim forms, sent because 2 John Deere loader arms and 1 Case IH boom had folded under ice-loaded bales that same week, and corporate underwriting wanted a second set of eyes before anyone paid or denied a dime. She didn't ask about brand loyalty or shop tree engineering. She asked for the log. The rancher handed it over without a word. 4 days of weld passes, wall thickness measurements, the 0.365-inch auger tubing set against the factory's 312-inch original, dated photographs of each bevel and each pass, and the repeated 1,800-pound bale holds that had left grease pencil marks on the shop floor where the tires hadn't moved. The inspector spent 40 minutes with an ultrasonic thickness gauge and a magnifying loupe, tracing bead lines along the sleeve joint near the pivot pin housing, tapping the steel, listening the way a doctor listens to a chest. She measured penetration depth twice. She checked the housing bolt torque against spec. Then she straightened up, looked at the frost-rimed loader still holding a round bale steady 8 feet off the frozen ground, and said the weld showed full penetration, adequate reinforcement, and no evidence of the kind of unauthorized modification that voids coverage. This was sound fabrication, not fraud, and she'd be filing it that way. The reversal came in writing 11 days later, coverage reinstated, the fraud flag struck from the file, the original adjuster's language quietly withdrawn without apology, though none was expected or needed. What mattered was the ledger. Calving finished out at 130 cows, every calf living, not one lost to cold, or to a machine that failed her when she needed it most. The banknote of $11,400 went out on time, paid from the calf checks and the sale of 6 cull cows, no extension requested, no late fee assessed. At the co-op, the talk changed shape permanently. Nobody called it shade tree engineering anymore. The mechanic at the salvage yard kept the story going better than any of them, telling it to every rancher who came through looking for auger steel, until it wasn't gossip anymore but something closer to instruction. The arms stayed on the Massey Ferguson for years after, weld lines going dull under work and weather, but never cracking, never flexing, carrying bale after bale through winters that tested lesser repairs and found them wanting. She never traded it out, never had reason to. It sat on her tractor the way her father's discipline had sat in her hands since she was a girl too young to drive. Proof, plain and unglamorous, that the ranch survived on measurement and patience long before it survived on luck.